more on China's economic data. We are joined in Beijing Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, sir. In Hong Kong, we have Hong Hao, Managing Director and Head of Research at BOCOM International. Welcome as well. In Washington, D.C., last but not least, we have Yukong Huang, who is a Senior Associate of the Carnegie Asia Program, where his research focuses on China's economic development and its impact on Asia and the global economy. It's wonderful to see you once again, Mr. Huang. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Liu, here in Beijing, the number robust still. What kind of message is China trying to send, obviously, to the rest of the world?
I cannot think of a better picture for at least by the statistical figures, because it shows two very much of the key word, which is stability and also positive prospect. The agriculture, the manufacturer service sector, they are displaying a high resilience over a number of challenges. But one thing I really feel confused if you read the other part of the picture is that the revenue, the government revenue has really reached more than 10%, whereas the disposable income of the individuals remain at 6.6. So this 4% gap really confused me.
Does that confuse you, Mr. Huang?
Well, look, I think the first half economic financial statistics are quite good, but if you look closely, you see some signs of concerns. Infrastructure investment is slackened a bit, so is industrial production. The trade data looks pretty good because exporters have shipped ahead of the potential trade war. And the budget situation looks pretty good because local government spending has not been as strong as people would like. And then I think that's why you see the difference. The revenues are pretty good, but expenditures are not very high. And I think this is the question for the second half. To what extent should the government try to actually expand the economy to a little bit because of the potential negative consequences of the trade war?
Talking about the trade war, China's Commerce Ministry also announced the total trade volume reached that is $21 trillion in the first half of this year, marking an annual growth rate of 16%. If you take a look at these numbers, exports, imports numbers are all showing robust economic development. Despite trade tensions, China's trade volume with the U.S. increased 5.7%, and its trade volume with some countries along the Belt and Road had also rapid growth. According to WTO, China's contribution to the growth of global imports was more than 13% in the first quarter of this year. Of course, Mr. Hong, having read all of these numbers, one could argue, the trade war did not start that early in the year, and therefore it is having a mild impact on all of these numbers we're showing for the first half, at least. But that does show a potential trend of how the trade should be going if those political risks can be avoided eventually. Mr. Hong. Mr. Hong.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very strong set of numbers. Obviously, the trade war started, probably announced around first quarter. So, we're yet to see the impact of the trade war coming through to the trade numbers. And also keep in mind that, because of the impending trade war and the risk of trading with other nations associated with impending trade war, many of the export orders would have been predated. Right, so people wanted to ship their orders out before the tariff being imposed on many of the goods. So, I would say that, it is a very strong set of numbers, but I don't think this set of numbers actually reflect the impact of trade war that is coming in the second half.
May I just follow up with you, Mr. Hong, about that, because the IMF for this year talking about 3.9%, things are getting beautiful, rosy in a way. Of course, IMF warned about the trade war's impact on the overall global economy, but we have yet to see the real impact of the trade war, because it's certainly not just between two countries. It's going to have a tremendous impact when you think about the ripple effects. Having said that, though,
that's right.
Inside the United States, there are already investors over the past 2 days suggesting the U.S. economy, which is recovering with beautiful jobs growth, as well as employment opportunities, as well as GDP growth, could have been hampered as a result of the recent trade war, and therefore not enjoy prosperity as much as they should be. So, Mr. Hong, from an economist's perspective, what do you make of that? But on the other hand, you see, Mr. Hong, this is the time when President Trump argued, well, that's the best time, let's start a trade war, because we're likely to lose fewer jobs because there are jobs growth already. So what do you make of this, comments coming from both sides?
Yeah, well, I guess no one really
Trump
wins in a trade war. So even if at the moment the U.S. seems to be ahead, because of a very strong set of economic numbers and also a very strong performing equity markets in the U.S. Now, the problem with that is that it actually bolsters Trump's resolve to start a trade war and to continue. So sooner or later, the impact of a trade war will be reflected in U.S. economic numbers and also the U.S. stock markets that refuse to correct so far this year.
Mr. Huang, I would love to go to you also about that. You heard about the CEO coming from BlackRock. That is one whose hand has trillions of dollars, talking today about the tremendous impact a trade war could have on the investment environment inside the United States, as well as the recovery of the U.S. economy, Mr. Huang.
Well, the consequences of a trade war take time to show up. It takes about 3 to 6 months for the impact to show up on trade, information, export, and import numbers. It takes about a year for the changes in investments, the relocation of plants, who you order from to show up. So you're going to see the effect occurring, let's say, this fall, this winter, and next year more than today. It's true that the American economy is very, very strong, but what the trade war means is they will not be growing as rapidly as they had projected. For China, the forecasts today are that if the full $200 billion of trade-related tariffs are levied over the next couple of months, this could actually have an impact of, let's say, minus 0.3% or even more on China's growth, say, starting from the end of this year into next.
Professor Liu, I guess the question for China could also be answered by you as well. I mean, on the one hand, as Mr. Huang just said, the impact of trade war certainly will be reflected in the Chinese economy, no doubt about that, bigger or smaller. That has to eventually look at the realities. But on the other hand, China is trying to push what they call the structural reform, mainly to focus its economy not onto the exports anymore, but rather on domestic consumption. So will this thing, so-called the negative impact of the trade war, in a way encourage China to turn that corner in a more efficient and more determined mind?
Yes, it turned out to be a propeller, actually, for China to engage in three...
Propeller skin deep or more than skin deep? That is the question.
Now, I think in the first place, the ZTE case really is really a very bone deep wake-up for China, to engage in innovation based on the very basic infrastructure technologies. And the other is that it also pushes China to really see the larger value of defending a global multinational trading network and also dispute settlement platform. And then it also pushes China to look for more diversification over its marketplace in terms of supply and also in the end consumer markets. And of course, it pushes China to further upgrade its industrial structure by pushing forward more innovation to help as part of the supply side reform.
Mr. Hong, that is the hope, at least, isn't it? If you see China has been making very good use of some of the outside pressure throughout the past 40 years during reform and opening up to make sure some of the critical moments that China would make the right choice. That could be the reference that China can rely on. And yet, will this one be the same, Mr. Hong? That is the question, isn't it?
Yeah, but well, I guess, you know, despite the trade war, I think China actually pushed forward with its reform and open plan. You know, for example, even though the new tariff has been announced, you know, China continued to push to open its financial sector as well as many other sectors, and also lower import tariff on many industries. For example, the car imports tariff as well. So, you know, I would say that, you know, despite the pressure, I think China is continue onto its reform and open scheme, and I think, you know, that is the right course of action to take, you know, in light of, you know, the trade war pressure that the U.S. president is trying to impose onto China.
Mr. Huang, coming from Washington yourself, though you have been working in China continuously for years then with the World Bank, what do you make of the internal debate as well as the interactions of narratives between what is going on in China right now and certainly that trade war apparently between China and the United States regarding the economic impact?
Well, what you see today is an American policy that essentially says that America can go it alone. They no longer need allies. They don't need allies in Asia. They don't even need allies in Europe. And that's because America thinks that past policies in some ways have not been actually helpful to Americans' interests. I think it's a wrong perception. And you see that comment coming out very, very strongly. So the challenge for China is how to address this. How do I address the fact that we're moving away from a rules-based system? And I think the recent discussions in Beijing between the EU and China is perhaps one solution. That is that Europe and China work much harder on forging what I call a more liberal and open trade and investment regime, and then openly express stronger support for a rules-based system and even for strengthening WTO. And if this works, if you can really make a lot of progress on this, it might then be able to counteract what I would call some of the negative signals on protectionism that's coming out of Washington.
But Mr. Huang, may I just follow up on that? You see, there are partners that has been long. For example, allied relations between Washington and the European capitals. That has been there since the Second World War. And yet, the relationship between China and the European countries are quite new in a way when you think about a strategic partnership in a new era. And therefore, how fast that bond will be nurtured and how much same dream that all parties have to have in their mind in order to get the agenda on track is a big question. Having said that, though, Mr. Huang, I do want you to help us about to understand better about that, about partnership in a new era, in a way.
Now, I think you're absolutely correct in emphasizing that the U.S.-Europe partnership, the alliance, has been there historically. It's very, very strong. The relationship between Europe and China and many of these concerns in terms of politics, foreign relations are much weaker. But think about what's happening. You have the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to establish a bridge between China through Middle and Central Asia to Europe, and that's a link that's going to be built. But what people don't realize, actually, is that Europe's foreign investment in China over the last 10, 15 years has been running about twice as high as America's investment in China. So Europe's trade relationship actually is much stronger. Europe, in terms of its production processes, their contribution to value added and production in China for exports is about 3 times as large as America's is. And that, again, is not self-evident to many people. So economically, in terms of both trade and foreign investment, Europe actually is more integrated into the Chinese economy than America is. But politically or publicly, that's not so self-evident. Now, this forms a potential basis because it can provide a basis for what I would call stronger political and foreign policy links. And that needs to be actually worked upon if this kind of alliance between China and Europe is to have any effect in shaping what I call
Right.
global governance rules, the rules of the game governing trade and investment.
Right, there's many segments of that story, of course. For now, we're only talking about the very early age of that story. Professor Liu, what do you think? I mean, having said all of this, our topic today is about China's economy. Our topic today is about the world economy. And therefore, what are some of the factors you would suggest us to look very closely regarding the backdrop of a trade war apparently going on for the national economy and certainly for the economy of the world for the second half of this year? Professor, briefly.
Well, I think now China is having this wake-up call, and China is for sure making further moves over its open door policy. So China firmly believes that the more liberal economic policy can really generate the positive impact both internally and also on the global marketplace. And the other is, okay, you know, we would like to ally with more of those victims of the U.S. policy so that we can really fight against the protectionist sentiment.
I see. Before we go, 20 seconds left for each of the other two guests. Mr. Hong, you want to go first? 20 seconds. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, in light of what's happening, the Chinese economy is doing exceedingly well, and that actually gives us some reasonable base, you know, to be strong, you know, in a trade war negotiation.
I see. Mr. Huang, finally for you as well, 20 seconds.
Well, you know, this is an unnecessary trade war in the sense that everybody's suffering. But I think China has no choice. It basically has to move forward in terms of the structure and the strategy that is laid out for itself. And if it does so, then I think it can survive.
Silver lining of a cloud, you never know whether it's going to work in your advantage. I mean, in the world's advantage, too. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Liu Baocheng, Hong Hao, Yu Kong Huang, really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.